You're listening to The Brief, a podcast from the Business Council of Alberta. I'm your host, Scott Crockatt, and in each episode, we dive into the stories of innovation, economics, and the people working to make life better for all Albertans. Let's get into it. So, Tyler, I know you as one of the leading policy and economic advisors in the country of Canada. You've advised prime ministers, deputy prime ministers, finance ministers, written a lot of policy. But for our guests, just take a moment and tell us a little bit about your journey, from the University of Ottawa to advising on the top policy for our nation's government.
Well, I should probably say, and thanks for having me, Scott, that, I've always been a liberal. That's probably not a surprise to many people.
I could have said that in the intro.
Yes, I've always been a liberal and been active in liberal politics, but I was always active as a volunteer. And so I kind of pursued a whole separate career in management consulting in the think tank world for the better part of probably 10 or 11 years until, we come to 2015 and I'm working in Montreal at the Institute for Research on Public Policy as the director of research, and the campaign's going along. And I've been an admirer of Justin Trudeau, but hadn't ever met him. And they win, and I had been asked for some advice, which I happily gave at the time of transition. And afterwards, they asked if I would come and work for the Prime Minister of Canada. And as I think you can probably imagine, that's the kind of question that you never say no to. The answer is only yes. And so it was an enthusiastic yes, and I came to Ottawa much earlier than I ever expected. To be working in government and to be working in politics. I always assumed that would be something that I would do at the latter part of my career, but it was more at the earlier middle part of my career, and had 8 wonderful years in government, working in PMO and finance, running the budget process, writing platforms for the Prime Minister, and then left at the end of 2022 to go on to do some teaching and some consulting.
Well, Tyler, we've asked you on today for a view into what we might expect from this government, particularly with a Western Canadian and Alberta focus on it. And you're a person that is uniquely positioned to answer that, as you were one of the primary authors of this government's policy platform document in the election. And the election is maybe the first and most obvious place to bring this up, that this election marks the 4th term in a row for the federal Liberals. But you and others have said that perhaps this time around is going to be different. What separates Prime Minister Mark Carney from his predecessor, specifically looking at his first couple of months in the office so far?
I think Mark Carney is change, but of a style that's probably a bit surprising to some people. And I say that because I think that if you stood back and were watching Mark Carney over the course of the last number of years, you might have thought, just listening to his rhetoric, that he would be a fiscal hawk and a certainly more right of center leader. And to a certain extent, he has elements of that, I would say. But I think that fundamentally is a misunderstanding of who he is and what he's trying to do. In part because I think to understand Mark Carney, you have to appreciate that he is first and foremost a central banker. And what I mean by that is that he thinks about the role of how to solve big macroeconomic problems. And the biggest macroeconomic problem that we face as a country and have for a while, not surprising probably to some of your listeners, is that there's been an underinvestment in the country, both by governments and by businesses. And that has limited our capacity to grow as a country and to raise our standard of living over time. There's many reasons why that was, but it's something that we've been living with for the better part of a decade, since the last commodities recession. So, fundamental to him is how to solve that question. And that requires a bit of a new toolkit in terms of changing how government involves itself in the economy and the way in which it supports private sector capital formation. But it also means a bit of a culture change in the way it approaches certain issues and thinking a little bit more about outcomes in that respect. And so while I think the Prime Minister will still be guided by many of the same values that Prime Minister Trudeau had, and I would make the case that he's a market-based progressive, he is ultimately different in that he starts from the perspective of how the market can be used to achieve progressive outcomes that improve people's standards of living, that address inequality over time and fill gaps where the market itself is not able to perform adequately. But he's not looking at it necessarily from either a necessarily redistributive function on a post-tax basis, or with a viewpoint of trying to ideologically reach towards a certain outcome.
You said that this parliament will be defined by 3 issues: Trump, economy, and unity. Talk to me about how this government is attacking those 3 issues in its first few months, and what you would expect to see from them, over the course of the next 6 to 12.
Well, I think at the top of the list, as you mentioned, is obviously dealing with Donald Trump, right? And I think there can be debates about, how best to position oneself in that in relation to Donald Trump, and that's probably not the easiest task in the world. But the most
Certainly, there are
important
great
thing,
debates over that, aren't there?
there are, and I'm not sure it really matters necessarily the height of the elbow per se, although that matters ultimately to an extent. I think what Canadians are looking for is a sense of stability in managing this sense of chaos and this external threat that has come to our doorstep. And the reason for that is because, of course, if you go back to what I just said about the need for creating the conditions for investment, there's no world in which businesses are going to want to make those investments, certainly to make those investments here in Canada as opposed to in the United States, if there's this ongoing sense of uncertainty about what will happen with Trump. Now, obviously, that means that we can't give away the store. We have to be careful about what we do, and we need to stand up for our values. But we've got to deal with Trump in a consistent and stable way. And so I think the Prime Minister has been really focused, regardless of the strategy, he's been really focused on just trying to take the temperature down a little bit on that, so that there's a sense of whether or not we can actually pursue an agreement, if you believe that there's an ability to have that bridge into something that when we get to next year in the reopening of CUSMA, there's that sense of forward clarity. The second and third point I would make is that, related to unity, obviously there's been a lot of question in the Alberta context about what's going to happen with separation and potentially even how to resolve some of the lingering differences that have occurred between the provincial government and the federal government. I think, while there was some tension early on between the Premier and the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister has really tried to demonstrate some degree of differentiation in approach, and a willingness to engage and listen to the province's priorities, and all provinces' priorities, by the way. I mean, obviously, later this week he is meeting with the premiers, and has been doing that fairly actively as a means of goodwill and engagement, even around taking in their considerations on what their priorities are for things like the C5, right? Which I'm not sure that if we were talking about Prime Minister Trudeau, he would have had not necessarily the same approach. Even if he believed in the same idea, I think he would have come to the table in perhaps less of a listening mode and more of a, here's where I think we need to go, and a sense of just wanting to drive towards that objective. I think this Prime Minister is certainly understands the need for listening as part of that unity. And finally, on the economy, I mean, very much it depends on what happens with Trump in the next couple of weeks, because if there's one really important variable over the course of the next number of months about whether or not Canada's in a recession, it's whether or not we face a high degree of tariffs.
Absolutely. Well, I want to spend some time diving into each of those. Maybe first off, let's talk a bit more about the economy, because I think for our listener base, this is one of the major areas that they are certainly concerned. They want to see better economic performance from Canada. I've heard it said that the Prime Minister is obsessed with competition. Is that accurate? And what should people take away from that? What does that mean?
Well, I think, I'm not sure that you could say he's obsessed with competition. I would say that he understands that the dynamism of the Canadian economy is less so compared to other economies in the world. And part of that is because we're a more concentrated economy in certain sectors, but we're also more concentrated in certain sectors where we have less competition. And that is, to an extent, a choice by virtue of federal market structure legislation, but also just because we're a country of 40 odd million people strewn across 13 different provinces and territories. And so it's hard to have as competitive perhaps of a air transportation sector, just because it's harder, more costlier to serve that population. But needless to say, there are things that we could do, like, for example, liberalizing internal trade, like, for example, integrating our labor market, like, for example, potentially taking down some of the barriers to competition of new entrants in other sectors in order to promote competition that will both have a benefit to driving and assisting affordability for Canadian consumers, but at the same time also reducing input costs on things like, whether it's telecom pricing or whatnot, that goes towards helping make us a more competitive and productive economy. The challenge, of course, though, is how do you execute that right now in a world in which we are facing an external threat from Donald Trump, right? Where it's hard to say we should want to open up a bunch and liberalize a bunch of industries at a time in which some of our Canadian champion companies are potentially under threat from an external threat. So in some ways, we kind of need, I think, that Trump factor to stabilize before we're able to make any movement on a competition or innovation agenda. And I would just say, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't note there's been a lot of effort at competition reform at the federal level in the course of the last number of years. That's not just a Carney thing. Like that goes back to Prime Minister Trudeau. There's been the most significant reforms to the Competition Act since the 1980s. And we're in this moment in which Canadians actually care about competition policy in a way that they haven't for 40 years.
Tyler, there's one issue that sort of merges both unity and economy, and that's energy policy. And it's no secret that energy policy has driven much of the friction between the West and Ottawa for some time, particularly between Alberta and Ottawa. And the Albertan view has been that environmental and energy policy has not been particularly pragmatic. Do you think we'll see a more pragmatic view to this area over the course of the Carney government?
Well, I think that you have the Prime Minister talking about such things as decarbonized oil would suggest that he wants to take a pragmatic approach. So that's a turn of phrase that you wouldn't have heard at the federal level in the course of the last couple of years. So I think for your members who are looking to see, is there a willingness to engage and talk? And is there a willingness to look at projects that support a growing energy sector that provides for a means, for unlocking that significant capital and investment and the good paying jobs that come with that? Absolutely. And in fact, in some ways, that's actually at the heart of the macroeconomic issue that I described, right? Because if you're looking at the drop in private sector investment in Canada in the course of the last number of years, a lot of that is a story about the energy sector. Absolutely. I would argue that it's not because necessarily of regulatory decisions, although we could debate that, but just the drop off of capex that happened in the sector after the commodities recession, and the fact that we'd already gone through a cycle of significant capital build in the oil sands prior to that, meant that Canada was absent tens of billions of dollars of capital investment that it would ordinarily have. And that absence of capital investment means the absence of jobs and activity that comes with those things. And so there's just no substitute in any other sector in our economy, right? We would have to grow the tech sector in Canada by a factor of 2 or 3 in order to just match the existing level of investment the energy sector makes. So if we want to continue to have, not just have, but grow that capital investment going forward, we have to have an active energy sector. The challenge will be, what is the energy mix that we want? How do we get those energy resources to market? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't put off the commitment that Canada and this Prime Minister still has of lowering emissions in both intensity and in total emissions over time?
Well, I certainly agree with you that we need a vibrant and healthy energy sector, and that the drop off in capital investment across many sectors, but especially the energy sector, has been really one of the more notable drivers of Canadian economic performance. And I will debate you on that point about how much of it is due to global macroeconomic and pricing or commodity conditions, because I believe quite a bit of it is due to the regulatory and policy environment that we've had over the last while. But that leads me perfectly to the thing I wanted to ask you, which is, if there's one turn of phrase I've heard maybe used more than any other in the time since the Carney government has been elected, it's the term grand bargain. And so the question from the West is to you is, do you believe there is a grand bargain or something like that to be done here? For instance, of more carbon capture for more oil development, pathways for pipelines, if you wanted to put it that way, but just generally, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, look, I do. I think that is absolutely possible. I think it's notable that the Prime Minister has mentioned that getting pathways built is one of his top priorities, and one of the top priorities for the list of what would be sponsored, federally supported nation building energy projects under C5. That being said, right, I think at the same time, but we do want pathways to be built. And, part of what's standing in the way of getting pathways built is in part an economic internal rate of return for the project, in part a question of federal subsidy, in part a policy approvals process, although that's probably been somewhat addressed, certainly with C5. But it's also, frankly, are you guys actually serious question, right? To be blunt, I think there's the perception in Ottawa that, we've heard a lot of talk about this project and the potential that it has. Is it actually going to get built? And I think Ottawa is kind of saying, like, look, we're willing to make the changes on the approval side. We may even be open potentially to examine the economics a little bit, but it has to work, obviously, in the current fiscal environment. But we need the industry to say clearly that it wants to build a project, because that, in a sense, is necessary in order to give credence and credibility to the government to be able to then turn around, to your point, on a grand bargain, to say, well, therefore, it makes sense that we can make adjustments to how we think about our total emissions, because this project is part of how we are going to get to a world in which we reduce emissions both on a marginal intensity level as well as on a total output level. And so there's just no world in which you could see a path to being able to increase production, or even to support new export corridors without pathways, because it undermines the ability to say that there's a credible path that still has emissions going down for both a Canadian and global context without it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's a great comment on it. And for any that aren't familiar with it, Pathways is the proposed major carbon capture project, and then follow-on projects after that to eventually bring oil sands oil to net zero. And Tyler, I can tell you, and for the benefit of those listening across the country, they are serious. You know, I've spoken personally to many, if not all, of the CEOs involved in the Pathways project, and others who are involved in other carbon capture. And they are quite serious. And I think that's one of the benefits of having this conversation is if some of what's standing in the way of us accomplishing what we need to do as a country is a level of trust and conversation, then we try and have those conversations and address that trust as quickly as we can.
Yeah, look, and I think I think the government wants that project to happen. As I say, I think it's, the Prime Minister has called it out a number of times as one that he's very supportive of. And when he talks about decarbonized oil, I think he has in many ways in his head the notion that once you establish the CCUS at the production level, right, you take out or significantly limit Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And so it makes sense that you can make an argument for more easy access to export corridors, where I think there'll still be a siting question about where that goes. But you kind of need pathways to happen first before you can have the discussion about the second. And I think the challenge will be, I think some people might logically say, well, I'm not going to talk about doing that unless I know I'm going to get more pipelines. And I think to try to reverse that sequence of logic, I actually think would undermine the ability to get all of this done.
You've mentioned Bill C5 a couple of times, which is the Building Canada Act, the bill designed to make it easier to do major projects in Canada and to designate them in the national interest. And I can say there's been a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about the ambition that signals that we've heard from businesses in Alberta and in Western Canada. What do you think, Tyler? Will the ambition of Bill C5 be able to survive the pushback and the practical realities as the rubber begins to hit the road?
Look, I think it will matter, obviously, what are the first sets of projects that happen. And in some ways, the federal government is in the driver's seat here because it gets to decide what qualifies as a nation building project, right? And so it can use provincial social license and provincial support as a bit of a gating function to both put the onus on the province as well as also on to the proponents to say, have you done the work necessary to demonstrate that you have support from Indigenous communities, that this project is not particularly surprising to folks, and that it's ready to go. So I think you will see the federal government probably be very strategic about which projects it chooses to go first. One, so that they are projects that are less contentious, which may be, for example, potentially electricity projects or, certain trade corridor projects. And people should not take from that, I think, any signal about what that means about other forms of energy, just simply that those may be the ones that are easiest to do first. And getting those easy to do ones first is actually super integral to the success of the rest of the system, because it starts to build confidence that these projects can be done well and fast. And those two things are not a trade-off with one another, right? Because I think the worst that could happen for the success of the entirety of what we're trying to do here is if we choose a project that is obviously in the national interest, but potentially very controversial, right? Think of, maybe Northern Gateway or a version of Northern Gateway, if we were to reopen that debate right now. If we've reopened it too soon, then it and certain kinds of opposition who are in the interest of wanting to oppose and stop that project, or are successful at putting enough of a roadblock in that project, it will gum up the ability to do all of the other things that we know we need to do, right? Whether that's airports, whether that's seaports, whether that's rail corridors, whether that's electricity interties, stuff that is much easier. That is the stuff that should go to the front of the queue, I would argue, and I would probably include pathways in that list as well. But those are the things that go to the front of the queue in order to give people confidence that we don't mean to actually trade off or undermine duty to consult with Indigenous communities, for example, when those commitments are made of accelerating those projects.
Mm-hmm. One of the other turns of phrase that's really caught attention in Western Canada is the Prime Minister's ambition to make Canada an energy superpower. That phrase has been greeted with a lot of interest, enthusiasm, broad agreement. Many CEOs and the Business Council of Alberta have signed letters saying, we agree with this. And I want to give you the chance to respond to a direct quote that I heard the other day, but I'll share it without attribution, though, which was in talking to an international investor about that ambition to be an energy superpower. They said, well, that sounds really great, but if Canada wants to be an energy superpower for real, why not just abolish the oil and gas emissions cap on day one? How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say, abolishing the oil and gas cap, I think, misunderstands where Canada is at this moment. Now, is there a need potentially to look at adjustments? Is there a need to look at changes? For example, how do we integrate pathways and those projects into the oil and gas cap? If you do pathways, that might give you license to potentially look at and treat all of those potential projects and source emissions related to them those companies differently. And that is, again, one of the reasons why I think it is in industry's interest to want to get that project built and done as soon as possible. But it also misunderstands where the public is, because I think as the public understands that on one hand, we want to build and we want more energy. That clearly stands out in public opinion today. The public also still wants ambitious action on climate change, and that's going to continue to be a fact that lives with us, especially as we deal with significant high-impact climatic events like wildfires, for example. And so I'm not saying that these two things are connected, but you can imagine the public's mind, right, that will continue to put the issue of ambitious climate action at the forefront. And this is a prime minister who cares about ambitious climate action. And so you can see how it's irreconcilable, or I shouldn't say irreconcilable, but it becomes very difficult to see a world in which you would completely remove the oil and gas cap in order to make a case that somehow we're going to become not only an energy superpower, but to use the Prime Minister's words, clean energy superpower. So I think it matters that we look at opportunities for adjustment and effective implementation that allows Canada to still grow its energy sector, that allows Canada to grow its ability to potentially contribute in ways that reduce overall global emissions, and how we potentially trade with other countries in a way in which brings down emissions and allows us to help switch out higher emissions overall. But remember, when you say net zero by 2050, which is a commitment that Premier Smith herself has agreed to, it means net zero. It means zero, right? And so it's hard to see how you would completely undo something like the oil and gas cap and then say, but we're still going to reach zero by 2050, right? I just think it's hard to reconcile both where the public is at and also where, and the Prime Minister, who himself is somebody who believes in ambitious climate policy.
Yes, and I will point out that I think the Prime Minister's words were clean and conventional energy superpower, which that specific wording was seen as being very important by the existing and conventional energy sector. Well, Tyler, we always try and keep these brief, and I think you've done a fantastic job explaining some of what's going on in the minds of the Prime Minister and the federal government at the moment. But if you want to just zoom out for us generally, speaking to this audience of a lot of Albertans, what do you think the Alberta audience needs to know about the first priorities of this government and what we might expect to see over the course of the next period in time?
So look, I think there's tremendous opportunities for Western Canada and for Alberta with this new government. And I think it's easy to look at this government and say, well, obviously it won a bunch of seats in Quebec and it has a bunch of senior people in senior roles who are from Quebec, and think that means that the government is predisposed to ignore Western Canada. And I would say that is a complete misunderstanding of both the Prime Minister and this government's intent. It's a misunderstanding of the Prime Minister because he himself obviously is an Albertan and comes from the Northwest Territories, and that is very much core to how he thinks about it. Obviously, it's been a while since he's lived in Alberta, but he regards himself as therefore somebody who understands, I think, the important role of the province in the Canadian economy, especially as a contributor to things like capital investment, but also because I think in this quote unquote time to build, a lot of the projects that we will end up building, whether they're AI that's going to happen in the superclusters that exist in Edmonton and Calgary, whether it's the ability to build trade enabling infrastructure that helps get energy products to market, including conventional energy sources, whether it's the ability to share our electricity with each other across Western Canada that might create opportunities for places like Manitoba and British Columbia, as well as help to unlock new things like data centers, for example, in Alberta and other infrastructure projects in Saskatchewan. There's huge opportunities there that the federal government not only is going to help to support through smart regulation, but also potentially fiscally. And I think, it would be wrong for people to assume, that Mark Carney is simply a smarter Justin Trudeau, which he's not. He's a different person, but also that there isn't a real sense of goodwill to want to address, I think, some of the frictions that have existed in the intergovernmental relationship between Alberta and the federal government for a while. And he will, if I were to make a guess, we talked about this a little bit earlier, if there were to be a next challenge to face this government after, hopefully we deal with Donald Trump, it could be the issue of unity in Western Canada. And I actually think he will approach that issue from a perspective of listening and engaging, much in the way he has so far in the early moves that he's made as prime minister, because he does legitimately care about this. And we should note, has a very sizable caucus in Western Canada now, which is a dynamic that Liberals and the Liberal government have not faced in a number of cycles.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point. If the approach to addressing the unity issue is listening and engaging, it's my firm belief that addressing the legitimate underlying concerns and grievances is one of the best ways that we can promote unity within the country. So what a lovely place to leave it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap, but the conversation doesn't stop here. If today's ideas inspired you, share the episode and help us keep the momentum going. You can also support the show by rating and reviewing us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in to The Brief.